Today's story is one of the most tragic that I've ever researched. A man respected by his community turns out to be a mass murderer. It has very sensitive content related to children being harmed in a school setting. If you are faint of heart or have a weak stomach, please take a moment to change the video. Viewer discretion is advised. A few miles northeast of Lansing, Michigan is a small, rural, very tight-knit community of about 12,000 people named Bath, Michigan. And it's a very strong blue-collar farming town. And in the 1920s, it was much smaller with only about 300 residents. And what happened here was absolutely unimaginable. It changed the city, the citizens of the town, the surrounding area, and it rocked the nation. On May 17th, 1927, first graders from the Bath Consolidated School had planned a field trip. They were going to go to a nearby farm to visit and explore the farm. About 3 weeks prior, the teachers had reached out to the owner of this farm, who's Andrew Kehoe, asked him if we could bring the kids around and take a look at the farm, maybe learn a little bit about the animals that you have there and some of the plants while they eat their lunch. Andrew responded and said, "The day that you're looking at is actually supposed to rain, which is the 16th. Why don't you come on the 17th, the following day, which is a Tuesday, and you should be clear to have a great day." Andrew was a very prominent member of his community. He was a school board member. He was the treasurer. He was also the former township clerk, and he was a very smart man. He was college educated, an electrical engineer, and for all intents and purposes, he was very well liked in his community. He did have some of his demons, though, just like we all do. In his most recent election for clerk, he actually lost that. He was temporarily filling in for township clerk of his predecessor that passed away while in office. He was having financial issues with his mortgage and his property taxes. His wife's health was in decline. It was said that she had tuberculosis. The prognosis was very grim for her. And some of his neighbors said that his financial struggles were because the following fall he did not till or cultivate his land. He has 80 acres, which is the same farm that the kids would come to visit. He didn't till that the prior fall. And because of that, he didn't have any money to be able to pay his subsequent bills. Andrew was a staunch opponent of taxation, and Andrew used his position as treasurer to the school and also the clerk for the township to be able to kind of lobby against this taxation to try to get it reduced. He felt it was unfair to homeowners and farm owners. The tax was implemented about 5 years prior when they built a new school. See, Bath had small one-room schoolhouses littering the entire surrounding area. There was about a dozen of them, and they wanted to consolidate those into one school where they could have buses, a little bit more updated schooling system, and more kids could be in one building as opposed to spread out across multiple. So that's exactly what they did. They created the Bath Consolidated School. And because of that, with all the new improvements, they had to raise a lot of money to be able to pay for it through the taxation. It's said that the taxes only went up by about 10% though. Andrew was really feeling stressed out during this time because he had just lost his position as township clerk, and now his position as the treasurer for the school board was about to be exhausted this summer of 1927. So he knew he was running out of time, only about 3 or 4 months before he would be out of office for that as well. So on May 17th, the first graders finished up their lunch trip to his farm, and they packed everything up, got on a school bus, and they went back to school, finished out their day there, and then went back home to their families. The following day would be May 18th, and it was a very average day. It felt just like all the others. The school buses arrived at bus stops, they picked up the kids, they brought them to the school, cued them, and got them off into their classrooms. Teachers were setting up the classroom curriculum, writing it on the chalkboards. Kids were kind of freely roaming the hallways as they start making their way to classes, which classes started at 8:30 a.m. The bell rang and kids made their way into their classes and sat down. The second grade classroom actually started their day with a book read. So they grouped up on one of the inside walls there close to the front chalkboard where their teacher would sit down and the kids would sit down on the floor and listen to her read a book. The sixth graders that day had their final exam, which would be held on the first floor in the fifth graders' room. The teachers felt that the sixth grade classroom was a little bit too noisy and maybe too comfortable of a setting for the students, so they brought them downstairs into the fifth grader room. The farmer from earlier, Andrew Kehoe, would also help out at the school. He was kind of a handyman, maintenance man that would stop by and fix things whenever the school needed. He was ancillary to what they already had. They kind of had an on-site maintenance man, but anytime he needed an extra hand, they would reach out to Andrew. That morning, they did just that. They saw Andrew driving down the street, and they flagged him down and said, "Can you help us with a boiler, a water boiler real quick? We're having issues, and we need to provide hot water for lunches that day." So he went with the maintenance man downstairs into the basement and took a look at the boiler. And after about 20 minutes of looking at it, Andrew got kind of very visibly flustered, stood up, and without saying anything, just left the building and drove home. At 8:45 that morning, Irene Dunham, a 19-year-old student that would normally be in class, she was finishing up her senior year. That day, she had a very sore throat and was just kind of staying at home sick. She could have been playing hooky, we don't know, but she didn't feel good, so she was at home about 4 miles to the northeast of where the school would be, so she was quite a ways away from the building. And that morning at 8:45, she heard a loud boom outside, and it sounded like it came from the southwest, which is where the school would be. And that's exactly where the sound came from. At 8:45, an alarm clock triggered 200 pounds of World War I dynamite. The dynamite was placed in the basement of the northern wing to the school, and when it exploded, the entire northern wing of the school kind of collapsed on top of itself. 36 kids and 2 teachers were instantly killed. Survivors were seen rushing from the building. Debris was still falling. Some of the timbers that hold up the inner structure of the building were falling. There was dust everywhere. There were school desks and books and lockers. It was just a mangled mess that these survivors had to crawl their way out of. Rescuers were to arrive just a few minutes later as some of the more able-bodied survivors were to find their way out of the building, and they all started simultaneously searching for more survivors, anyone else that they could help get out of the rubble. And this is the part where things become a little more graphic. Viewer discretion is advised. The sheriff recalls arriving on site, and when he did, he went immediately to action to try to look for survivors. And one of the first things he had seen was a foot, a shoe kind of sticking out from the rubble. And he walked over to it and he tried to pick the rubble up and lift the leg or pull the leg out to see if he can help get somebody to get out of this dangerous situation. But the only thing that came with him was the lower leg. It was not attached to anything. These events and the tragedy that happened was only a day before their graduation. This was supposed to be a time when family and friends and everybody should be celebrating something fun and moving on to new aspects of their life, but instead they're sitting here picking through debris to try to find who survived a very disgusting attack. On the lawn just outside of the school would be Mrs. Eugene Hart. She was sitting there on the lawn, crying very heavily. She had her daughter on her left and her other daughter on her right, and she also had her son on her lap. All 3 were killed in the blast. 30 minutes or so after the detonation, a truck were to pull up right up to the front of the building, and he motioned to have some people come over and get some stuff out of his truck. So a couple of people came over, the superintendent, 2 teachers, and there was an 8-year-old boy that was kind of in the vicinity. He had survived the blast and was just in the general area of where this truck was. The truck was loaded with more dynamite, and shrapnel was wrapping the dynamite. So the driver shot it with a rifle, exploding the dynamite, which killed all the people in the vicinity, including the 8-year-old boy, the superintendent, and the 2 teachers. It also killed the driver of the truck, who was Andrew Kehoe. As the truck exploded, a woman was standing about a block away with her baby in her arms, and she was kind of watching as things unfolded and survivors were being rescued. She didn't have much that she could do to help with this young infant child in her arms. But when the truck exploded, a piece of shrapnel shot towards her and her baby and hit her daughter in the head, actually causing lifelong permanent brain damage. The tight-knit community really did pull together, though, in this time of need. Anyone that was not able to dig through the rubble and debris to try to find somebody brought other things in there to help. Some people brought shovels, and other people brought food. Some of the ladies that had kids brought food with them and drink for the rescuers and for the kids that made it out. Somebody started a registry to try to keep the names down and match them up with the parents as they arrived. It was a very chaotic scene with people running everywhere and sirens going off and debris falling. But they did the best they could in the moment to try to save everyone they could. And they were able to pull the final survivor out of the debris about 12 hours after the initial explosion. All told, 38 children would lose their lives, 2 teachers, the superintendent, and 4 additional bystanders would all be dead at the end of the day. That is when they were able to start the investigation into what happened and why did it happen. Knowing that Andrew Kehoe was the one who drove up to the building and exploded a secondary bomb, they immediately went to his residence to try to figure out what part he had in all of this. And when they arrived, they found his house was leveled. His house was actually packed with more dynamite as well, and a timer set for the same 8:45 a.m. to explode simultaneously with the school's explosion. The only thing remaining of his home was the chimney stack. And they also found that either the night before or that morning before going to the school, he had tied his horses, he kind of hog-tied their feet so they couldn't move, and then lit his barn on fire so that nothing could be usable out of his barn. He also cut the bark on all of his trees, which effectively kills the tree that can't survive that. And Andrew's intentions were to make nothing of his farm usable. He was very upset with this taxation. And so he knew that he was going to go out. And when he did, he didn't want anyone to be able to use anything from his farm. He cut grapevines and then made it look like they were still whole. So they all died. All of the mature trees died. He blew up his home. He destroyed his farmland and his barn along with all of the animals. One thing that they were looking for was his wife. They couldn't find her anywhere. And so more than a day later, they were checking the tuberculosis clinic to see if maybe she was in for treatment. But it turns out that she was in front of them all along. She was badly burned and destroyed from the initial explosion of their home. And her body was laying on one of the tillers that cultivates his property. They had walked by it dozens of times and nobody knew that that was a body. That's how damaged it was. As they investigated more, they found another 500-pound cache of unexploded ordnances in the other wing of the school. So in the basement of the north wing was 200 pounds, and in the other wing there was a 500-pound cache of unexploded dynamite. Now this cache also had the same timer set to it as the north wing, but investigators assume that the north wing blew up and damaged the trigger mechanism for the other wing. So it never blew up. And if it would have blown up, it would have most likely taken the entire school down along with all 300 occupants. The final investigation would find that Andrew Kehoe worked alone on this, and his motive was just anger towards the city. He was a very disgruntled person, and although other people did know certain things were happening, like the mechanic in the basement of the warehouse in the school when the boiler needed work, and then Andrew Kehoe got up and left. They investigated him and said he had no part of it. So the true conclusion was Andrew Kehoe worked alone on this thing, and he would just turn out to be a maniac bent on damaging the city as much as he can. Now, there was one girl that ended up surviving the explosion, Beatrice Gibbs, and she survived with both broken legs and a broken left arm. And she had shrapnel scars and marks all over her body, so much so that they built her a special contraption to hold her in bed so that it wouldn't hurt as she laid down in bed. 3 months later, as she was undergoing surgery to try to remove some of this shrapnel, she ended up dying on the operating table. National newspapers picked up this story very quickly and spread it throughout the country, so much so that it damaged the city as more than 85,000 people flocked to the city and they wanted to just drive by where the explosion happened and where his house was. And luckily for the city, Charles Lindbergh would perform his flight from New York to Paris just a few days later. And that quickly silenced the city. Everybody left and the newspapers changed topics. It was really good for the city because it gave them an opportunity to kind of mourn their losses and cope with it the best way they could. Bath is not a wealthy town, and a few prominent figures in Michigan's history came forward to really help out. One of them was the governor, and he offered to pay for funeral costs for anybody that was involved in the explosion that couldn't afford it themselves. And Senator James Cousin was formerly a VP and a very high-level executive at Ford, would come forward and pay for the entire rebuild of a brand new school to replace the Bath Consolidated School. That school would open in 1 year from after the explosion occurred. I'd like to thank everybody for staying this far. Brand new channel. I do a lot of work on TikTok. If you would like to watch some of my short videos on TikTok, I plan on releasing 1 to 2 of these videos every week. So if that's something that you enjoy, please follow, subscribe, click the like button, turn on the bell thing. I appreciate everybody for staying this long. Thank you very much.